of the ThinkFest. Today, we have a fantastic guest with us, and it is Professor Jared Rubin from from Chapman University from the United States. He is also the co-director at the Institute for the Study of Religion, Economics, and Society. Today's topic question is going to be around his new book, Rulers, Riches, and Religion. And the basic question that we shall be grappling with is, how did the Muslim Middle East, or the Muslim world as we know it, diverge economically and fall behind the West, starting around about the 12th century? So, without any further ado, let me ask Professor Rubin to tell us a little bit about his book, and then we can build our questions around it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me and entertaining this, and everything that you guys have put together. It's really amazing. So my book, as you described it, gets at this one of the big questions, I think, in economics, just world history in many ways as well. Why, on the one hand, why did parts of Europe pull ahead at some point in economic history? Yeah, this is where industrialization took off, where the modern economy took off. But the counter to this is, why didn't this happen in the Middle East first? And it's not an obvious question to answer at all. It's one that I'm sure many of your, and these maybe many don't know, that the Middle East, at least and many other parts of the world, were well ahead of Europe. Say 1,000 years ago for sure. Probably as recently as say 700-800 years ago. The Middle East was not alone in this. China was certainly ahead of Europe as well. But the Middle East is, I think, in many ways more interesting to try to understand why this reversal of fortune happened, for a number of reasons. One is that it just proximity-wise, there was a lot more ties between Europeans and Middle Easterners, particularly kind of in the Levant, North Africa, and then in modern day Turkey, Anatolian Peninsula. There had been, these were Roman areas. So there's also a cultural background, and Islam itself is also, in terms of when we think about religion and what that means for cultural outcomes, is much closer to Christianity than it's different. And certainly, being part of the Abrahamic faith, there's a very similar cultural background. And these were the questions that have interested me since I became an economist. It's something that has always fascinated me. And the questions I looked at, and I looked at in this book, were, on the one hand, what role did religion play in this? And I think I should preface this by saying my main findings are not so much that religion in and of itself, doctrine in and of itself, played any role. And I think this goes back to something I just said, namely that Islam and Christianity are in many ways are much closer than they are apart, especially when it comes to say economic doctrine, things like this. But what it does, what the difference I look at and think through an economic lens, and then spell out through historical anecdote, is the role that religion plays in politics. So it's more of what economists call an institutional story. We look at the political institutions, religious institutions, how they feed into economic institutions. And this is something that has diverged from a very long period ago. Beginning as early as the late medieval period, when Europe, in many parts of Europe, the church, while it was certainly a powerful political player, you start to see secular rulers beginning to gain strength vis-a-vis the church. And this is actually precisely the period where it becomes stronger, a little stronger later, actually, in the Ottoman period, but in various polities in the Middle East, religion was gaining strength, if anything, in terms of, this is a period where, especially, even beginning in the 12th century, where you see the rise of madrasas, for instance, the religious establishment has consolidated. It plays an extremely important role in legitimating rule, and that's what the book is mainly about, is how rulers stay in power and it looks at and again, this is kind of what we would call an institutional story. We're thinking about what are the institutional mechanisms through which rulers stay in power. We think coercion might be one, meaning just the access to power, raw physical power in some ways. So this might be done through military leaders. It might be done through police force. Really, anyone with access to coercive power might help you do that. The other group that might help you do this are people that can legitimate you. And what I mean by legitimacy is cultivating a belief that the ruler is the rightful ruler. Beliefs like this matter. And we're seeing this in the United States, where I am right now currently, or at least we did last month, where there was a major crisis of legitimacy in our president. And this is something that it's something that can be fostered by other people in society. And this is where religious authorities historically really played a major role in both Europe, Christian Europe, and the Muslim Middle East. Again, my book mainly focuses on the Middle East, not the entirety of the Muslim world, even though I think the institutions that the political institutions of the Middle East certainly have been either directly transmitted or in some cases copied in other polities as well. And so the idea is that this is something that goes back to the origins of the two religions. Islam was born with empire. It was as the original corpus of Islamic doctrine, not just the Quran, but particularly the Hadith and Sunnah, were being formulated. This was done in the context of an empire that needed legitimation. This was very quickly became the largest empire the world had ever seen. Stretching from South Asia to Spain within not that long of time. And this is something where a new empire like this needs legitimation. This is one of the reasons that's been given, not just by myself, but in the broader literature, why the early, Muslim world, particularly say the Abbasid Empire, did so well, was that it was able to kind of unify large swaths of land at least under one. It's not just religion. It's also currency and protection, things like this. But it really made a great place for merchant activity to happen. And again, because of this, though, Islam is pretty good at legitimating rule. There's plenty of doctrine that allows for this, and this is the kind of the one piece of doctrine that I point to. Everything else is more of an institutional story. Christianity was born in the Roman Empire. For its first 300 years, it was a minority religion. The Roman Empire did not need legitimation through this group, and early Christian doctrine really has almost nothing on how Christianity might legitimate. Now, eventually, it does. But economists use the term margin a lot, and what we mean by thinking on the margin is you just think about differences between, in this case, differences between areas. So yes, Christianity might have been good at legitimating rule, but not as good as Islam has historically been. What the book does is it takes this kind of basic institutional facts and draws out. We think about how this might. At least at first, we think about how this might affect the relationship between rulers and various players in society that might keep them in power. And what the framework, I propose a framework at the beginning of the book, and then the rest of the book is mostly history that kind of supports this framework. It says that if you think about all of the players in society. In a society where religion is very good at legitimating rule, you get, not surprisingly, religious authorities having a powerful seat at the political bargaining table. But what it also means is that when religious rules that might be antithetical to commerce, even though religion is often not antithetical to economic development, but when it is, those rules are still likely to stick around. Because people who might want to violate those rules, the most famous one being something like lending at interest, even though that's was something that was, of course, was around in both Islam and Christianity. When you have religious laws that are like this, or just the fact that in many parts, certainly say the Ottoman Empire, the religious courts were the primary courts for commerce as well. That you get people not violating those rules, or at least to the extent that they're violating the rules, they're finding workarounds, as was the case with, say, lending at interest, that come with significant cost. And another thing this does is it also affects the political economy of the regions more generally. And I think what I mean by this might be best done by an example from one of the chapters in my book, where I look at the spread or lack thereof of the printing press. So this was something that famously did not really spread for the first 3 or so centuries. After it was invented in the Ottoman Empire, it was known. So it was invented in 1450 in Mainz, Germany, and it was known, at least this is what we believe, by 1485. There's some historical back and forth on just how strict these were, but in 1485 there was an edict by Sultan Bayezid that banned printing. And then this printing ban was reestablished 30 years later in 1515, and we don't really hear anything of it for the next 200 years. This was printing in the Arabic script that was banned, so minority presses, like presses printing in Hebrew or the Greek script, were allowed to print. And there's been a lot of work looking at this, and what I push in my book, and this is based on work I've done with others as well, is that this is a consequence of when you have religious authorities having a significance at the bargaining table. Now, it's not that this is something that in and of itself printing is purely anti-religious or violates some type of creed or anything. It's that printing threatened the religious establishment. The religious establishment at the time had an intellectual monopoly. They were the ones that were the sole interpreters of both religious works, certainly Islam, it is, and in everything that is associated with it. And all they had to do was look to Europe to see that the church by 1450, by the year that the press had been invented, had already lost much of its power vis-a-vis secular rulers, for reasons I kind of just said, that you'd already seen by say the 13th and 14th centuries, European rulers starting to not rely on the church as much for legitimacy. So the press spreads there quite quickly. The church couldn't have stopped it if it wanted to. And pretty soon after that, the church plays a major role in the press plays a major role in undermining the church via the Protestant Reformation. And this is something that leads to what we call a very fundamentally different equilibrium in the two regions. One where, especially in those places where the Reformation took hold, you get very, very little religious influence in secular rule, or in rule at all. I should say. Whereas even in Catholic Europe, you get more religious influence in secular rule, and certainly in the Middle East, where the Ottomans, if anything, were bringing the religious establishment into the state. In precisely this period, they play a major role in legitimating the state and must have a major seat at the political bargaining table. And I draw out the implications from there. And I think one of the big implications is that in Europe, this is the period soon after the Reformation where you start to get the rise of parliaments. And these, parliaments represent, in some ways it's the people, but it's not really the people in the sense that, they still represent somewhat elite interest. But more often than not, they'll be the economic elite, or people that have some type of commerce, some type of trade, that they benefit from this. Now, I think, kind of a very key thing to keep in mind is that I'm not by any means saying that these people are, these economic elites are doing anything out of the kindness of their own heart. They want to see the state succeed, and that's why when they have a little more political power, it ends up being a good thing for society. It's very much that they're acting in their own interests. We can think of all players as in this game sorry to use this terminology, as acting in their own interest. Religious authorities have a certain set of things they want. Oftentimes, what religious authorities want, both in Christianity and Islam, is just suppression of rival religions. Or sometimes they want the state to enact certain types of laws that might benefit themselves. Military elites are the same way. They have a very different set of desires, but there are certain things that they want, and when they're at the political bargaining table, they aim to get those. Economic elites are the same way. Now, some of the things they want, and this is I think a key point the book makes, is that the very first things they want are those things that we often think of as being the best for economic development. So stuff like property rights, secure property rights, still a thing that in many parts of the world are needed for economic development to arise. Stuff like investment in public goods, like roads and bridges, waterways, maybe more modern information communication type of utilities. These are things that benefit the economic elite. So oftentimes, these would be the first things they push for. Now, this is not to say that a government run by the economic elites can be a good thing either, by any means. I mean, they also push for bad things, like monopolies, favors for friends. So it is I think the upshot of the book, we could say, and then, just in a theoretical basis, and then moving into the history, is that bringing the economic elite to the table, to the political bargaining table, is important for economic development. It's not the only thing you need to do, and there are many ways that you can do that. One thing that historically, though, then bringing this back to the history, that really kind of caused at least parts of Europe, and to be clear, it's not all of Europe. It's northwestern Europe. It's mainly England, to a lesser extent, modern day Netherlands, where the modern economy first took off. It was getting religious authorities out of the political bargaining table for reasons quickly. It's only don't have but so long here to describe a good, let's say, decades worth of work, but that's the idea, is that we should be thinking about who's at the political bargaining table, what do they want, how strong are they in terms of their power, and this is all stuff that's historically determined. I think I'm by no means somebody. I'm an economic historian. I'm not somebody that's looking to say, well, what's the best government or anything like this. But I think there are lessons that can be taken from this as well. And for me, the biggest lesson is how to think about what are the prerequisites for economic development. There's nothing about saying you have to do it the way England did it, even because England was the first place to industrialize. There are some general features, though, that seem to be pretty beneficial when they're there, and not beneficial or detrimental when they're not there. And a big one is when religious authorities have a really big seat at the political bargaining table. It's really hard for other types of interests to get a really strong seat. And this is not to say that religious authorities are going to be looking for stuff that's detrimental to economic development. Oftentimes, they just want things that are kind of independent of economic development. Doesn't really harm it. Doesn't really help it either. But there's a big cost associated with that. And it's the types of laws and policies that might have happened had they had a better seat had others had a stronger seat at the political bargaining table. And I think that in about 15 to 20 minutes here gives a bit of a summary, plus kind of what you might be able to take from the book. It certainly is a book of history in terms of, and I think all of these questions, when we think of what are the big reasons that one society might be more successful than another, these are inherently historical questions. And I don't think you can understand within any society how you got to where you are today, or even in the past, without really knowing the past. It's not just a matter of looking at GDP statistics, looking at trade, the basic things economists often look at for thinking about what makes for a successful society. Each society is going to be a little different. Their culture is going to be a little different. Their institutions are going to be a little different, and these things interact with each other. And that's, I think, in a nutshell, what this book is about.
So in your book, you talk about how societies get onto certain paths, and we have certain equilibriums. So certain equilibriums are growth enhancing, in the sense that you get onto a growth path and you stay there. But others, like the Muslim Middle East from the 13th century onwards, start to stagnate. So would you like shed a little bit more light here on what are the necessary conditions for resetting the path that you're on?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think in terms of thinking about these paths, it's what I've described as kind of an institutional path. It's who's there, what I call the political bargaining table, to bring to the outcome of the political bargaining table is formulating laws and policies. Now, we can think about that political bargain as kind of the short run thing. The longer run thing is how are the identities of those people at the table changing? That's what kind of we might think of as really mattering for long run economic development. In the short run, at any given point in time, the outcomes you see are going to be dependent on who's sitting there. And that's just, so, and I think, to your question, at any one given point in time, that's a little less important. What's really much more important to getting on the right path, as you asked it, and I described in my book, is thinking about, all right, well, on the one hand, we kind of have an idea that at minimum, not having, some type of, I use the term economic elite, but really what I mean are people with, that are self-interested in things like secure property rights, things like public goods that might spur on trade or investment, or particularly investment in jobs, that and they would want these things for their own self-interest. Now the question is, how do you get there? I think on the one hand, there's many paths. So you ask for necessary conditions. One is that if you look at what I looked at, which was not just the Middle East versus Europe, but even within Europe, there ended up being a fairly large difference between, say, what we would call Southern Europe and Northwest Europe. So Southern Europe, we might think of as like Spain and Italy, two places that were leading Europe throughout much of the medieval period, ended up falling well behind. One thing that those two places have in common, much like the Middle East, was that religious figures, religious authorities, had a fairly large, significant role at the political bargaining table. For Spain had a worldwide empire. Yet the Spanish crown was also, known as the Catholic monarchs, because they, especially with the Spanish Habsburgs, were in bed with the Pope. Obviously, the Italian states, even though there were many of them, were more religion-based in terms of their political bargaining table. And this is, so this is something that's not just a Europe versus Middle East. We actually have multiple cases within each where we see that when there is an overabundance of religious power at that bargaining table, or when they have a strong seat, it's not. And I want to be clear, because there's a bit of nuance here. It's not just that religious authorities want certain things that are bad for economic development. In fact, it's not that. It's two things. One is that they're having a strong seat at the bargaining table precludes others who want things like, those things I talked about, property rights, from having a seat at the bargaining table. And second is that when they have a strong seat, they tend to continue to have a strong seat over time, because the lure of religious legitimacy is really attractive for rulers. I mean, we see this in different parts of the world today. This is something where, I think, I think a lot of, say, what's been happening in the last decade in Turkey is a very interesting case study, because this was a society that had gone quite, strikingly secular in the 1920s and continued that way for a while. But there's always this lure of religious legitimacy that I think Erdogan's really kind of tapping into. And in general, when that happens, it's not good for economic development, but it's also a really hard thing to kind of move away from, in part because religious legitimacy tends to be pretty cheap. We think of stuff like rights over property and people and just power more generally as being something that's the big prize that rulers really don't want to have to give up if they don't have to. Religious authorities tend to not ask for that. So it's the type of thing, there's no like easy answer to this. because it's generally not going to be in the interest of people in power if their society is set up such that religious legitimacy is something that's important and it's something that is readily available. It's going to be really attractive to use. So without massive reform, and really massive reform that goes against the interest of those in power, it's very hard to set this in motion. I would say, and I would. This is one thing where I think many Muslim states have a higher bar to clear, just because, for reasons I say, the religious legitimacy is just a little more potent. It's a little more powerful for historic reasons in Islam than it is in Christianity. And that, I mean, that's really the reason why that this kind of historical paths matter in this case. So I hope that answered your question.
We see in the 19th century, for example, that in the Muslim world, in the Middle East, a number of institutional innovations which have happened in the West. Everything from the banking, modern banking, to the joint stock company, or the modern corporation. These ideas were kind of adopted wholesale, and started kind of functioning in the Middle East. So, what kind of conditions allow for that kind of this joint change to happen?
Yeah, no, I think that this is it's a good question as well. I think that to some extent, this had to do a bit with almost the shock of the West pulling so far ahead. So certainly in something like in the Ottoman Empire, you had the whole Tanzimat reform, which takes a good 30 years, and this is something where the Ottomans, I think, slowly realized that what they thought had at one thought was impossible, it was happening. That on many fronts, it wasn't just purely military front anymore. It was certainly economic and minimum. That said, I think that it kind of does take something like this in terms of on the one hand, there being kind of a cultural realization that the society can really gain from massive reform in some way. But even many of the original reforms were done kind of either, well, on the one hand, either through direct investment from foreigners, which, I think that this, in a number of the reforms, it wasn't purely internal either. And that's generally not a good thing when that happens. When reform is imposed from the outside, that I think that almost is always a bad thing, in part for reasons that I discuss in the book, namely that the very best types of reforms are ones that are done kind of within the cultural context, that are done, so for instance, I think it's really hard to imagine massive reforms happening in any country where religious legitimacy is extremely important, if those reforms completely cut out religion. And I don't think that a lot of the 19th century reforms really did. Now, yes, on the one hand, they were a lot of what they were doing was copying. It was eventually it was banking. Eventually, stuff like the corporate forum comes in, and you do get waves of modernization throughout the Muslim world. Now, in terms of I think there's two things to consider though. One is that it's one thing to kind of borrow, say, economic institutions. You might think of these things as economic. If the associated kind of broader institutions don't really change in terms of particularly the political institutions and how we think about how political action is done, the ultimate benefits of those economic changes, I think, are going to be muted as well. So, in my opinion, listen, I think that this is something that comes out of the type of work I do, and it's not just my own work. I think this is broader, the broader lesson of the best work that's done on institutions is that kind of merely copying or merely taking institutions, or frankly, the much worse way, the other way around, is like imposing institutions on a society. We should be thinking of institutions as a package. There's political institutions, there's cultural institutions, there's economic institutions. Your question was mainly about economic institutions. Those can work in isolation, but to the extent that they work well and that they're long lasting is another question. And in some cases, in we'll say the Middle East or the Muslim world more broadly, they did okay, and in other cases they didn't. And in most of the places that they didn't, it ended up being political institutions that kind of stymied any type of growth that might have happened.
The interesting thing about the political bargaining here is how they work, how the political bargaining process actually works, and coalition. So in the early days of the empire of Islam, religious legitimation was very important. But at the same time, we see in the first 400 years or so, a lot of innovation happening on the legal side, which actually spurred growth and allowed the Muslim world at that time to pull ahead of the West. So, but when we see that kind of coalition breaking down, where the economic entrepreneurs, the commerce people, the traders, and so on, they start getting pushed back. And you have this more, what we call a kind of a conservative, territory view emerging, which has been argued as one of the reasons why the world has started stagnating. So, the question that I have here is that how can we go about in a political context, building coalitions, especially in societies like you're saying, where the information is important and we need social. So in that kind of a context, we need to have some kind of a coalition working together as a bargaining table, which has the incentives aligned towards economic performance as opposed to stagnation. How do you go about what would be, let's say, the necessary conditions for setting up such a coalition?
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, I think that's the right question if you're thinking about, to kind of get at the type of thing you were just talking about with, what would be the path. It is setting up that type of coalition that brings the appropriate people to the political bargain table, and by the appropriate, I mean at least having some type of economic coalition. And I think something you also mentioned there is extremely important, namely that this was something that. This is not unique to the Islamic, or this is not something that will be fundamentally new to the Islamic world. In fact, it was the golden age of Islam. The first, say, 400 years after the Prophet. It was a period where, at minimum, the what I'm describing as the economic elite really had some type of. Political power is actually too strong, I think, but there weren't other forces that were really trying to keep them out of political power as well. So I would say on the one hand there's precedent. On the other hand, I think that everything has to be done in its own context, and I think that this is I think one of the things that really comes from this is that the type of path that parts of Europe took to get those coalitions that you're talking about, and ultimately those coalitions that you're talking about ended up being parliament, being the various parliaments, not just in England, becoming supreme, and there being coalitions within parliaments of these various economic elite, but also religious elite to some extent, military elite to some extent. But the path that those places took is one of many possible paths. Now, you asked the right question in terms of, I think that the answer does definitely lie in how do you get the right coalition. My own take on it is that the Muslim world's obviously it's an extremely diverse place, and the answer can be very different depending on where you're talking, and depending, I think, what I'm going to call recent history. Now, for somebody who's interested in economic history like myself, recent history means last century or two. But where religious legitimacy has played an important role, and again, that varies in the Muslim world. So so maybe like some of the Gulf states, it plays a bigger role, and other areas it doesn't. Religious authorities are going to have to be part of that coalition. I think that it's foolhardy to think that you're going to be able to assist, at least in the medium or short to medium term, sustain any type of coalition that tries to go completely, secular, completely in the interest of, say, the economic elite. Building coalitions is also hard because when people try to build coalitions that bring them to power, that almost, but it's not exactly a zero-sum game, but it can be pretty close. Political power. It often means that those that are currently in power might stand to lose some. So thinking about the types of trade-offs that can be made in terms of, all right, if potentially a religious / economic party, or if you want to think about it in terms of party politics, that doesn't completely step on the toes of the current regime. Now, whether that's if that's a military regime, that's going to be really hard to do. And one thing I note in the book a number of times is that there's nothing unique about religion and religious authorities. We can think of like military authorities as being another way to stay in power. What I described before as coercion, and that can be just as, if not more, detrimental. It often is more detrimental to economic development in the long run. But to get back to your question, when you have a military regime in power, maybe they don't care about religion at all. Oftentimes they won't. That's where, on the one hand, it can be hard to overcome that because they might have a near monopoly on coercive power. But on the other hand, that's also a time when alternatives might become more popular, at least among the people. And again, that would be a time I would think, particularly in at least certain parts of the Muslim world, where alliances, coalitions between the economic elite and the religious elite might bear fruit, and might bear economic fruit as well in the long run. So it's a hard question, and it's context specific for sure.
One other point of divergence, the difference between where the West, specifically let's say the church, with the clergy in the Muslim world is organized. Islam does not actually have education clergy as such. So there's much more fragmentation. Now, do you think that has played a role as well? Because the case in the West, you have the Catholic Church, and you have the Protestant, Reformation happening. But at the end of the day, the people at the bargaining table, we were dealing with the kind of population. It was the church. Whereas in the Muslim world, there were many different clerics at play. So you think that is important when it comes to at the bargaining table trying to craft coalition? It kind of takes me back to what W. Quran writes about how the Islamic law of inheritance, for example, the fact that we had multiple heirs made reconstituting partnerships slightly harder compared to where we had primogeniture. So do you think that would also, the way that religion is structured, organization of it in terms of church, would it play a role?
Yes, no, it's a good question. And there's a recent book that came out a couple of years ago by another economist, Jean-Philippe Plateau, who looks primarily at this question. And I think his and my answers kind of go together very well. He looks at the fact that, as you mentioned here, Catholicism, at least not so much Protestantism, but Catholicism was very hierarchical, and it's kind of broad, pan-European institution. Eventually, beyond Europe as well. Whereas Islam's highly, at least Sunni Islam is highly decentralized. And what does that mean for the way that clerics negotiate with rulers? As you said, there are going to be various seats of real clerical power in Sunni Islam that is just very different from, in at least medieval Europe, where you had the Catholic Church as the power. You had one pope. Of course, you had bishops and archbishops, things like that. But those people were not independent seats of power. There was not, this kind of various so there was this one institution, and what he looks at in his book is he thinks about how that means who are you negotiating with if you're a ruler. Are you negotiating with one big church, or are you negotiating with various clerics at various places? And I think that the way I'm thinking about it as well is also what to answer your question is, yes, it matters, because one thing it does is that when you think about political bargaining, is it makes the political bargain for the Muslim ruler in this case. I think it makes it a little bit easier, because it makes it easier, but with a big threat at the end. And on the one hand, it makes it easier because it's easier to find clerics that will support you, because not all clerics are under this kind of monolithic church. They're able to kind of interpret doctrine the way they want, to obviously within bounds. But this often would happen. I mean, certainly, one way to rise up the ranks in the Mufti hierarchy in various places, but particularly the Ottoman Empire, which is, as you might be able to tell, the place I'm most familiar with, was to write fatwas that were favorable. On the other hand, though, it also does mean a source of instability, because it does mean that there might be religious authorities that are left out, and sometimes those are powerful, especially those that don't necessarily want to sign off on fatwas that maybe aren't the most pious things in the world that rulers want to do. So to answer your question, yes, I mean, I think that this does matter a lot. It's not something that my book covers much. I mention it in a couple places, that the fact that these institutional forms, the religious institutional forms, are very different. I think in part because I did start down this path, and it was one of these things, like you start down a path and then you realize you need to write another 200 pages or so if you want to cover it well. But also because I think it kind of fits in with the broader theory as well, and namely that when we think about what the underlying key is, it's the role that religion plays in politics. And yes, that is going to very much differ by the way that religion is structured.
So going forward, when it comes to it from a policy perspective, if you're sitting somewhere, let's say, the necessary path out would involve obviously restructuring who is sitting at the bargaining table. And that could happen either endogenously over a period of time, incrementally, or it could happen, through some exogenous shock. So we saw that, recently when we had the Arab Spring picture, there was a kind of a thinking, of the political bargaining table in several countries. But that didn't pan out. So do you think that these kinds of exogenous shocks would perhaps be necessary to kind of change the path that you're going to stuck on? Or do you think that it can happen?
Yeah, no, I think that for at least in my opinion, the answer is it matters what type of exogenous shock you're talking about. If it's an exogenous shock in which, say, either a foreign power, like we would have seen with the U.S. invasion of Iraq or something like that, is attempts to impose institutions, it's almost never going to work out well. Just because as I say, I think that institutional development that takes cultural characteristics into account is necessary for those institutions to succeed. On the other hand, there are other types of exogenous shocks. It could be a different type of conflict. I would think more something like natural disasters that require a massive response by the government. Oftentimes, those are times where there's opportunity, and there's opportunity for new players to come in and fundamentally change who has power, and again, in both the short, but also then eventually possibly the long run. Because once different groups get in power, they often do what they can to stay in power. And this is kind of one of the points of the book too, is it's not just what I was just describing, there's institutional change. Those people that do what they can to stay in power then are people that are in charge of, are help formulate laws and policies that they're often doing so in their own interest. So yes, I actually, I agree with you that some types of exogenous shocks, but that might be useful, but they're particularly ones that require a response from within, that require a response that is consistent with both the cultural and historical past of that society. And essentially what's in the menu of options that a society has. How are we going to respond to a giant earthquake or a tsunami or something like this that devastates part of the society? Sometimes those types of responses are ones that fundamentally change who's at the bargaining table. And I think that I think that's what you're getting at here. And if it is, I agree with you. I think that is definitely one way. Endogenous change takes a lot longer. Yeah.
When you deal with so one last question, and then going forward, do you see any signs of a significant divergence happening in the Middle East that you think can be built upon?
Sorry, I missed what you said. Do I see any signs of what?
I'm saying that do you see any signs of the change in path happening today in what we see?
Yeah. It's a great question. I tend to be a little more optimistic on some fronts, and more pessimistic on others. So to take, say, the oil states in the Middle East, it's a very mixed bag there, in that this was in it. You can think about it as a one-time, even though it's a 50 to 100-year shock of riches coming in that could potentially transform institutions. In some places it's happened, some places it hasn't. And to be honest, in a place like Saudi Arabia, I would be a little worried about the long run future there, just because the type of institutional change you'd want to see is not there. I think that there are some states that, and of course, this was in many ways the hope of the Arab Spring, I think, was that you would have, whether it be just more democracy, at least in the Arab states where this happened. But it's maybe with the exception of Tunisia, it's not. I think been, at least, and we're still very much in the short run of this. I don't think the promise is what it once was. But I think what I just said is the word of caution, that and maybe it's just because I'm a historian, this is the way I think, but we're still in the short run with a lot of these changes. And frankly, when you take a place like Pakistan that had a colonial history, and in fact, ultimately many parts of the Middle East ended up having, at least some European colonial influence. I think that we're still feeling the effects of some of a lot in many of these places, and many of the post-colonial states today. And a lot of the effects are via politics. So I am more of an optimist, though, that this can change. It's just whether this happens. I'd be a pessimist that we're going to see massive change in the next, say, decade. But I think the path, as we've been calling it here, could begin at any time, and frankly might have already begun. And events like the Arab Spring, you mentioned this term exogenous. I think in many ways that was exogenous, in that there was a spark in Tunisia that spreads throughout. maybe maybe we're just in a downswing right now in some of these places. I really hope it's not the case. Yeah, sorry for such an equivocal answer there. It's a hard question to answer. It really is.
Got two audience questions from the audience.
Oh,
first,
sure.
That Malaysia is a Muslim country with a lot of religious influence, just managed to develop. Have you seen how that is happening?
Yes. So so you're asking about the first one I see here with the so non-Muslims playing remained a majority in the Middle East for a long period.
No, I told you about the Malaysia one first.
Oh, the Malaysia one. Malaysia's a Muslim. Okay, sorry. Oh yeah. Okay, so I should preface anything I say on Malaysia by I am absolutely not a Malaysia or Southeastern Asia expert. This is Malaysia, I think, is very much the type of case where economic interests have had this is my perception. I should preface this by saying this is my perception from just reading newspapers. It's not really as much an academic perception. But one where, at least in recent history, economic interests have had a better seat at the bargaining table. And I think Malaysia is actually a great example of, I think, such a key point that history is not destiny, that just because you have something, X in your society, whether it be, Islam playing a role in politics or something like that, it doesn't necessarily mean that Y, maybe bad economic outcomes, are going to emerge. It might mean they're more likely, but it also might mean there are other paths. And in fact, this is something where the historian in me is a little out of the zone, in that I think there are other paths within even highly religious Muslim states to have both short run and very long run economic success. Again, I'm not going to say anything about how Malaysia has done it, just because I don't feel comfortable as an academic saying something I'm a little out of my depths on. But I think it hits all from all I know, it hits all of the key points in terms of what you need at the bargaining table. Now, how you get there, maybe we can learn something. I think that's a great question.
Second question from the audience is that non-Muslims remained the majority in the Middle East for a long time. That Constantinople is Christian essentially. How did this play a part in all?
Yeah, it's another good question. Yeah, if you look at the Ottoman Empire, for instance, it was this highly diverse empire. They had Southeastern Europe, which had remained Christian for a long time. Yeah, Constantinople, even well into the 16th, 17th century, was up to at least 30% Christian. Yeah, and one thing it obviously means is that where you Muslim rulers are ruling over non-Muslims. The same would have been true, obviously, in South Asia, right, where you had, the Mughal Empire, or Muslims ruling over Muslims and predominantly Hindus. Where you have that religious authority or religious legitimacy is just a little less effective. So to the extent that had it been the case that say the Middle East had remained Christian, or other religions, Zoroastrian or whatever, instead of turning to Islam, that would have a major impact, certainly on the theory, but also obviously world history, more importantly. No, but I think that this is the idea, is that religious legitimacy is one way that rulers stay in power. It's not the only way. In fact, if you're just relying on religious legitimacy, you're probably not going to stay in power very long. It definitely helps, and it helps and it certainly helps all the more when more of society is religious. But, and then, I think this is a kind of an important point. It's not the only thing that keeps it afloat. So yeah, it's definitely true that large parts of the Middle East and many other Muslim polities had to rely on other things as well, especially in those places. As I mentioned, the Ottoman Empire was the dominant empire in Southeastern Europe for centuries, much of which never really became Muslim. They rule differently there. Essentially that's the answer.
One last final question from the audience. Does your Ottoman thesis
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think of Safavid, the Safavid Empire, I mean, I think to some extent, yes. Now, this was also an empire that very much brought religious authority into the state. I mean, it was Shia, of course, and if anything, I think this is something I've been wanting to write on for a while. I'm not. I've read a lot on Iranian history in particular, but it's not something I've ever really kind of put pen to paper on. But I think the answer's got to be yes, just because it's if anything, the religious hierarchy that comes out of kind of early Safavid thought is it's so conducive to legitimating rule, and it's in a different way. So Shia Islam is to go back to a question you asked earlier. It's much more hierarchical. It actually, in some ways, looks more like the Catholic Church than it does Sunni Islam in terms of the way it's structured. And I do think that when that is kind of coexists with the state, that it can be, and I think it was very powerful. And in fact, you could. I'm not willing to go there yet, as putting my academic stakes on it, but I think you could make the case that the political bargaining table is even all the more the way I've been describing it in early modern Iran. That's a nice question.
Thank you very much, Jared, for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Follow up. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has